So, this week's Inside the Lords has been the Lords spending the whole time talking about what's happening inside the Commons, because apparently this was the big week of the rebellion in the Commons, where all of those MPs who were perfectly reasonably pointing out that the Rwanda bill won't work as it's presently constituted, said that they wanted to put in amendments to make it more effective. Big rebellion. Two deputy leaders of the Tory party resigned. Everybody thought we were on the brink of revolution. And then yesterday, when it actually came to voting against the government, with a whimper, they scampered away and only 11 voted against the government. Now, what do I think about this and what's going to happen next in terms of the Lords? The first important point is that it is an incredibly irritating situation to be in, where a very important discussion about the fact that the government has lost control of the borders, or has failed to take control of the borders, and has messed up the asylum system to such an extent that we no longer are in control of who enters the country or not. And that control of the borders would allow us to have a free and open discussion about levels of migration, immigration, what asylum seekers really are, what the distinction between asylum and refugee is, because by the way, there is a difference. Asylum is where you really are fleeing war and persecution. Refugee status is much more where you're immediately getting out of the country, and usually it's to a nearby country. Anyway, all of that's got into a complete muddle, as we know, and the government have managed to narrowly conceive of the only way that we should discuss this in this country as to whether a few hundred people should be deported to Rwanda or not. And we now get ourselves into this mess. So even if the amended Rwanda bill had gone through, that would not have resolved the much bigger problem, which is that the issue of control of the borders is not resolved. Secondly, that international law is constantly being used as though it's a fixed entity that should be able to stop sovereign decision making by an elected parliament in the UK. And this is something which the Lords have proved to be particularly adept at pushing. So the way that the Lords will deal with the bill now that it comes to us is to actually try and gut it even further by constantly citing not just the Strasbourg Court and the Court of Human Rights, but also say that our reputation will be sullied internationally, that we've signed on for all these international treaties, and effectively tell Parliament that there's no point really in passing any of these bills because it will be stopped in the law courts. And that climate, which is really pushed by people in the Lords, is so bad for democracy, because it's effectively saying, not just to Parliament, but more importantly to the voters, it doesn't really matter what you want. If we can find an international treaty to say that it will be bad for us, we won't let it pass, we won't let it happen. It's likely that it will be caught up in the Lords with endless amendments to remove those parts of the bill that would allow the government to at any point send anyone to Rwanda, which would therefore render it meaningless. There will be endless arguments within the Lords debates. It will then go back to the Commons, then back, and there will be ping pong. It will be delayed for months, and probably the government, which has proved itself to be spineless in most regards, will concede on a few things as well, so it'll soften the bill somewhat. But anyway, it's a kind of time-consuming exercise, a complete waste of parliamentary time, and actually, regardless of the fact that I will spend my whole time really getting infuriated by those Lords who are trying to stop this bill, it's not because I support the bill. And what I object to is that the emotional energy of the whole of the British public is expected to be wound up with that, which completely misses the point. Immigration is, however, a flashpoint at which I can see that for many ordinary people in this country, it epitomises the contempt that they feel they've been, how they're being treated. So just on that, there were two short debates today that illustrate something which I find really interesting about lawmaking, but two short debates. The first one was on integrating people who already have refugee status, how we should integrate them into UK life. And the whole premise of the debate, which was only an hour, and we were all given 3 or 4 minutes each to join in, was about how we can help new people who got refugee status get housing, get benefits, ensure that if they're kicked out of their hotel accommodation and they're given 28 days, I think, to sort themselves out, they won't end up being homeless. I'm not suggesting, by the way, these things aren't important. And one of the important things is that if you are going to accept people as refugees, that they then are part and parcel of British society. But everybody wanted to kind of talk, not everybody, but the majority of people who put that motion forward wanted to discuss it in a technical way, what local authorities are doing, how we can better integrate people. What nobody wanted to discuss, which are much more difficult questions, which is that it's very hard to, in good faith, integrate people who we've given refugee status to if you don't believe that that refugee status is likely to be trustworthy and that they were probably waved through because of the asylum crisis backlog and so on. It's very difficult for people to feel generous when they're being told that there's not enough to go around, that there's a housing crisis, that council's about to go bankrupt, and yet somehow there's a kind of special status being given to these newcomers to the UK. And the third issue, which is of course the one I feel most passionate about, but I managed to miss time I speak, so I didn't get around to explaining properly, is multiculturalism, official multiculturalism, which rather than inviting people in to be integrated into what it means to be a British citizen, spends the whole time developing divisive identity politics strategies which encourages people not to actually integrate into the UK or into a sense of what it means to be a part of this national story, but actually encourages people into living segregated parallel lives. The second short debate, slightly related as well, was on RE teaching, religious education teaching. And I happen to believe that teaching religious education is very important, not because I'm religious, but because in this country, in order to understand literature or art or the whole history of actually democracy, philosophy, what happened in the Enlightenment, you have to have some knowledge of both the iconography around the Judeo-Christian tradition. You have to know something about what happens in the Bible, for example, to be able to understand half the poems you're going to read, or to go into an art gallery and know what they mean, or even to understand where our democratic franchise came from, because that was all came out, and the sense of free speech came from religious tolerance, and John Locke and the Civil War and so on. So, these things are important. But the technical way that this was discussed was, how can we attract more teachers to be RE teachers? We're going to have to set up bursaries where they get paid more money. There was a kind of big argument about the government aren't doing enough to encourage the best graduates to be RE teachers. Anyway, I chose to tackle this one by suggesting that being an RE teacher today might be the worst decision you'd ever make. And I used the examples of how religion has become mired with identity politics. So, for example, one religious education teacher is in hiding for his life. The Batley Grammar School teacher, he in an RE lesson showed a picture of the of Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad. This was considered to be offensive. There was mobs outside the school, and he was basically sacked by the head teacher. No solidarity whatsoever, and it was treated as though he'd committed blasphemy in an RE lesson. Perfectly legitimate thing to do. We have other examples where Christian teachers, one Christian reverend was sacked because he gave a Christian sermon in a Christian school that offended the identity politics offence mongers around gender and as distinct from biological sex, and because he put forward a Christian view on marriage. So I was making the point it's kind of fraught with difficulties, and obviously at the moment, and you should follow it if you're not, there's a massive controversy about Catherine Birbal Singh's Michaela School, in which the school has banned Muslim prayer because it was being used in a politicised way almost to bully other young Muslim pupils in the school if they weren't religious enough. It was being used to threaten teachers. They were being called Islamophobic and so on. And we have Jewish kids at the moment under threat of anti-Semitic attack and so on. And is that a religious or a political point? I was just making the point that it's fraught with difficulties. And one of the biggest threats to RE teaching that's coming down the line, which I will make sure that is a real focus of my work in the Lords, is the conversion therapy bill. Now, of course, that was on the bit of the page that I didn't get to in my speech. I'm very annoyed with myself because you'd have to be a very brave RE teacher at the moment who would answer the questions of the pupils who say, as a Muslim or as a Christian, in the traditional understanding of either the Quran or the Bible, what does Sir or Miss think of same-sex marriage, or whether we can transition from one gender to another? What does I mean? If you actually answered in conscience according to what the religious teachings, the traditional religious teachings are, you could end up in a criminal court, accused of conversion therapy, because you might say, no, that's completely against your religion. And if you were a person of faith yourself, and occasionally it might be nice if the odd RE teacher was religious, because they might know a thing or two. But if you were, then you'd be accused of letting your faith be used to try and bully pupils and so on. So I think that the conversion therapy bill is a real threat to genuine religious freedom and matters of conscience, and so I made that point. Just finally, what's coming up next week is the Victims and Prisoners Bill. There's all sorts of, it's a bit of a messy bill, but there's all parts of that bill about creating a victims charter and so on. The first part of the bill on victims, although I could speak endlessly on why I'm worried about victim-centred justice, I do want to ensure that at least when they talk about creating all these different bodies that will represent victims of women and girls who are victims of either sexual violence or domestic abuse, I want to make sure that the people who are acting as service providers for those people are actually women, by putting it in the face of the law, because as Sex Matters have just revealed recently in a new report, a lot of the rape crisis centres, a lot of the people who provide services like that are not allowed to organise their services around women only, and biological women as defined. So I want to make sure of that. And also I want to, taking my lead from the campaigns around prisons, just ensure that that the data collected in terms of crime, both perpetrator and victim, we're very clear that we're talking about men or women, because we're obviously in this absolutely ludicrous situation where male rapists who transition and be called she, so on and so forth in court. So I'm going to be doing that. And the second half of the bill, I'm actually going to be looking at the issue of indefinite these IIPs, indefinite prison sentences, because I think it's as great a miscarriage of justice as the post office, and I hope to be doing a lot of work on that in the next few weeks. And inevitably, the Rwanda bill will come to the Lords in some fashion, and everyone will get very excited about it. But to me, I'm afraid it's a waste of time, even though I will speak in defence of national sovereignty when it comes to lawmaking.